It had been coming to this gate for longer than the cemetery existed. It had never found it locked before. It stood there all night. It will come back. The eastern gate had been unlocked every full moon night for longer than anyone working this cemetery could remember. Not left open by accident. Not forgotten in the way of someone whose attention had drifted at the end of a long day. Unlocked deliberately, with the specific care of someone who understood that the unlocking was not a minor administrative detail, but the most important single act performed in this cemetery on the nights when it was performed. More important than the maintenance records. More important than the drainage checks. More important than anything else, the role of groundskeeper at Haldren Cemetery required. And the role required a great deal. It had required it across 32 years of Corvin Mayall's life, across every groundskeeper before him, going back to the cemetery's founding in a highland valley that had been here considerably longer than the cemetery, and considerably longer than the settlement that built it, and considerably longer than any record of human presence in this place reached. The gate had been unlocked. Then the new administrator arrived. She locked it. What came to the gate on the first full moon night after it was locked had been coming to that gate for longer than the cemetery existed. It had never found it closed before. It stood at the closed gate for the full duration of the night, from moonrise to the first gray of dawn, without moving, without forcing the lock, without making any sound. Corvin could hear from the groundskeeper's cottage 40 meters away. It simply waited. Corvin watched from the cottage window and understood, in the specific way you understand things that arrive below the level of professional reasoning, that what he was watching was not anger, not threat, it was confusion. Something that had been coming to this boundary for generations had arrived and found the terms of the agreement changed without its knowledge, and was trying to understand what the change meant. Corvin had been maintaining this agreement for 32 years. He had never once had to explain it to anyone, because in 32 years, nobody had ever asked. He did not have the language for it. He had never needed the language for it. And now, watching something vast and patient standing at a locked gate in the full moon dark, he understood that he was going to need to find the language very quickly, because whatever came to the eastern gate on full moon nights was patient. But it was not patient forever. This is Scar Howl. Subscribe and like before it starts. Let's go. Haldren Cemetery sat at the northern edge of a highland valley that the maps called Verith and the residents simply called the valley. The name on the maps had been given by surveyors who came through once and left. The residents had been here long enough to understand that this place did not need a name from outside. It knew what it was. The valley was compressed. Two ridgelines rising steeply on either side. A single road running south to north, ending at the cemetery gate. Beyond the cemetery's northern boundary, wall forest. Old growth. Dense. The canopy beginning immediately at the wall's far side, the near dark below it, permanent even at midday. The forest had been here before the valley had people in it. The people understood this. Most of them, anyway. Corvin Mayall was 61 years old. He had been the groundskeeper of Haldren Cemetery since he was 29. Tall, spare, the specific leanness of someone who had spent 3 decades working outdoors in all weather, without ever once considering whether the weather was suitable for working in. His skin was deep, warm brown, weathered at the cheekbones and the back of the hands from 32 years of highland sun and highland cold. His hair was close-cropped, gray throughout now. The gray arriving so gradually across his 40s that he had not registered it as change, but simply as the ongoing condition of getting older in a place that aged you honestly. His hands were large and careful, the hands of someone for whom the specific physical requirements of maintaining a cemetery had become so deeply known that the hands knew what to do without waiting for instruction from the mind. He wore the same dark green work coat in every season. Heavy canvas, the collar worn pale at the fold. The pockets deep enough to carry everything a full day's work required. The maintenance log, the gate key, the small torch, the folded cloth he used to clean the stones when the weather left deposits. The coat had been with him for 20 years. It had absorbed enough of this valley's conditions that it had stopped being a coat he wore and started being simply part of what he was when he was in the cemetery, which was most of the time. He lived in the groundskeeper's cottage at the cemetery's southern edge. 2 rooms, a window facing the eastern gate. A stove that he kept going from October through April and sometimes into May, depending on the Highland weather's opinion of what constituted spring. A shelf of maintenance manuals and one personal log for every year of his tenure, 32 logs, the spines labeled in his careful handwriting, arranged in chronological order along the shelf above the stove. He had no particular interest in leaving. The cemetery required daily attention, and daily attention was what he gave it. He rose before the valley's light changed. He dressed in the dark the way of someone who knew exactly where everything was without needing to see it. He made tea. He stood at the cottage window with the tea and looked at the eastern gate in the pre-dawn gray and confirmed that it was as he had left it, locked or unlocked, depending on the moon's phase before beginning the day. Then the rounds. Main entrance first. The iron gates checked, the hinges oiled on schedule, the lock mechanism tested, the path from the entrance to the chapel, swept and edged. The chapel itself checked externally, roof, guttering, the specific stone on the northwest corner that had been working loose for a decade and that he repointed every spring without the organization ever having noticed it needed doing. Then the stones. He knew every stone in Haldren Cemetery, not in the way of someone who had memorized a list, in the way of someone who had walked past each one thousands of times across 32 years and had developed a relationship with them the way you developed a relationship with anything you paid consistent, careful attention to across a very long time. He knew which ones tilted east in wet weather and needed resetting in autumn. He knew which inscriptions were fading and required treatment before winter made them illegible. He knew the 3 stones in the northwest corner that the Highland frost attacked most aggressively each winter, and that needed checking every morning from November through March without exception. He knew a stone near the eastern path, a gray granite slab, modest, the inscription worn to near illegibility that he had been watching across 20 years of gradual fading. The name on it had belonged to a woman who had died at the same age Corvin was now. He did not know why he found this significant. He simply noticed it, as he noticed everything in this cemetery, with the specific, unhurried attention of someone for whom noticing was the whole of the work. He checked them all, every morning, in the same order, without exception. Then the northern path. Closed to visitors since before his tenure, he kept it clear of debris and overgrowth not because visitors used it, but because the path ran to the boundary wall, and the boundary wall required access for inspection, and the inspection required a clear path. Then the boundary wall. The wall was old stone, Highland granite. The grass at its base had not been trimmed in 32 years of his tenure, and had not been trimmed before that either, as far as the maintenance records showed. It grew in a specific way at the base of the wall, dense, low, the kind of growth that established itself over decades and became part of the wall's structural environment, inseparable from it. Corvin left it because Paris had told him to leave it, and the records showed every groundskeeper before Paris had left it, and the land agreement, which he had read and reread across 32 years, specified that the boundary wall grass was not to be disturbed. He had never disturbed it. Then the eastern gate. Always last, always checked twice. The most important single point of maintenance in Haldren Cemetery, which no official document acknowledged, and which the maintenance schedule listed simply as Eastern Access Point checked daily. He checked it daily. He had been checking it daily for 32 years. His predecessor, a man named Paris Olm, who had worked Haldren Cemetery for 27 years before him, had stood with him at the Eastern Gate on his 3rd evening and said only this: "Leave it unlocked on full moon nights. Leave the northern path clear. Leave the boundary wall grass. Whatever comes to the gate is not yours to question. It is yours to accommodate." Then Paris had walked back to the cottage without elaborating. Corvin had wanted to ask more. He was 29 years old. He had recently completed his groundskeeping certification. He had a professional framework and a set of reasonable expectations about what his new role would require. He had stood at the eastern gate in the dusk light and looked at the forest beyond the boundary wall and felt the specific quality of attention coming off the tree line and decided, at a level below professional reasoning, that Paris had given him exactly the information he needed and that pressing for more would not produce more. He had gone back to the cottage. He had unlocked the eastern gate at dusk on the first full moon night of his tenure and locked it again at dawn. He had done this every full moon night for 32 years. He had never once questioned it because the forest had never given him reason to question it. Whatever came to the gate came and stood and left before dawn without incident, without intrusion, without anything Corvin could point to in any official maintenance report as a problem requiring documentation. It was an agreement. Both sides had been honoring it for longer than Corvin had been alive. He had inherited it the way he had inherited the cottage and the maintenance schedule and the specific sequence of morning tasks he performed in the same order every day. Not because the sequence was mandated, but because the sequence was right, had always been right, and the rightness of it had transferred from one groundskeeper to the next across the full history of this place until it had become simply the way things were done at Haldren Cemetery. There had been a night in his 14th year, a full moon night in deep winter, the valley floor covered in snow and the temperature below anything. The highland weather usually produced when he had stood at the cottage window and watched it come to the gate through the snow. It had moved through the cemetery's outer field with the specific, unhurried deliberateness of something that did not find snow remarkable and had no interest in hurrying regardless of conditions. It had stood at the gate for the usual duration. It had received the acknowledgement of the open gate. It had turned and walked back to the forest. He had watched it go and understood, for the first time with complete certainty, that this was not a thing that the weather affected, not a thing that seasons affected, not a thing that decades affected. It would come on every full moon night for as long as there was a full moon to come on. The only variable was the gate, open or closed, acknowledged or not. He had gone back to the stove and made tea and written in his personal log, 14th year, full moon, deep snow. It came regardless. It will always come regardless. The gate is the only thing that is ours to control. He had kept that understanding for the 17 years between that night and the night the new administrator arrived and locked the gate. He had hoped he would never need to act on it. Then the organization that owned the cemetery decided it needed a new administrator. And the new administrator decided it needed new protocols. Solon Vray arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. She was 36 years old, medium build, warm brown skin, her natural hair worn in a low, neat twist. She carried a leather satchel over her left shoulder and a tablet in her right hand, and she moved through the world with the specific, efficient confidence of someone who had been competent at a demanding job for long enough that the competence had stopped being effort and become simply how she operated. She had managed 4 cemeteries before Haldren. She was good at it. She shook Corvin's hand at the main entrance with the direct warmth of someone who understood that the relationship between an administrator and a long-tenured groundskeeper required respect from the first moment, or it would require repair later. She was not a person who liked requiring repair. She looked at the cemetery with the assessing gaze of someone who was already building her operational picture, methodical, thorough. Her eyes moving across the paths and the stones and the maintenance infrastructure with the practiced attention of someone who had done this 4 times before and knew exactly what to look for. She noticed the eastern gate immediately. Corvin watched her notice it. He saw the flicker of assessment cross her expression, the specific look of a competent professional identifying something that does not fit within the framework of how things should be organized. An unlocked gate. A liability note forming behind her eyes before she had said a single word about it. She did not say anything about it that morning. She was thorough. She took her time. She walked every path, noted every stone, examined every maintenance record Corvin kept in the archive room with the careful attention of someone who took her work seriously and did not form conclusions before she had all the information. Corvin answered every question she asked. He volunteered nothing she did not ask for. She noticed the northern path. She noted it was listed as closed. She asked why. He said it was a long-standing access restriction with historical precedent. She noted it and moved on. She noticed the boundary wall grass. She noted it was untrimmed. She asked when it had last been addressed. He said it had not been trimmed during his tenure. She noted it and moved on. By the end of the first day, she had a complete picture of Haldren Cemetery's operational condition. She told Corvin she was pleased with the maintenance standards. She said he had clearly taken exceptional care of this place across a long tenure and that the organization valued that commitment. Then she said she had a few structural changes to implement over the following weeks and she would keep him informed as each one was actioned. Corvin thanked her. He went back to the cottage. He sat at the window and looked at the eastern gate and the forest beyond it, and held the word changes in his mind for a long time. He had been holding the word changes in his mind for a very long time before Solon Bray arrived. The organization had been sending signals for 2 years. New efficiency frameworks, new liability assessments, new standardization protocols that applied to every cemetery in their network, regardless of the specific character of each individual site. Corvin had read every document they sent. He had filed each one carefully. He had continued doing his job exactly as he had always done it. He had hoped the word changes would remain a word. He looked at the eastern gate. He looked at the forest. The forest looked back. The first change came on Thursday of the second week. Solon called Corvin to the main building at 9 a.m. She had a printed list. She went through it with the efficient warmth of someone who was delivering information rather than opening a negotiation. The northern path was to be cleared and open to visitors. It had been listed as closed for access in the operational records going back further than she had been able to trace. She had assessed it during her walkthrough and found no structural reason for the closure. New gravel would be laid by end of month. Signage would be installed at the entrance. Corvin said, "The northern path runs directly to the boundary wall. Opening it brings visitors to the wall's edge." She said, "The wall is in excellent condition. It is a significant historical feature. Making it accessible to visitors is appropriate use of the space." He said, "The grass at the wall's base has not been trimmed in 32 years. She said, "That will be addressed in the grounds maintenance schedule." She made a note. He said nothing else about the northern path. He knew, at a level below professional reasoning, that the northern path was not the battle. The northern path mattered. But the eastern gate was what mattered most, and he was going to need every piece of professional credibility he had when the eastern gate became the subject of the conversation. He did not spend credibility on the northern path. The second item on Solon's list was the eastern gate. She said it had come to her attention that the gate had no functional lock and had been listed in the maintenance records as permanently unsealed. He said, "It has a lock. I have the key. The gate is unlocked on specific nights and locked on all other nights." She said, "Which nights?" He said, "Full moon nights." She looked at him, the look of someone filing information and not yet deciding what to do with it. She said, "And the reason for that protocol?" He said, "It is a long-standing practice at this cemetery. It predates my tenure." She said, "I understand, but I need to understand the operational rationale. Unlocked access points after dark are a significant liability." She paused. "I will review the relevant records and come back to you." He said, "Of course." He went back to the cottage. He stood at the eastern gate for a long time. The forest beyond the boundary wall was dark and still and completely present. The specific quality of attention coming off the tree line was the same quality he had felt standing here on his first evening 32 years ago. He thought about how to explain what he needed to explain. He did not find the words that day. He tried the following Tuesday. He went to Solon's office in the late afternoon with his personal log and opened it to the first page where Parasolon's translation of the land agreement sat in careful handwriting. He set it on her desk. He said, "This is a translation of the original land deed for this cemetery. The condition in the third paragraph relates to the eastern gate directly." She read it. She was thorough. She asked about the provenance of the translation. She asked whether the original document had been reviewed by a heritage assessor. She asked whether the condition had ever been the subject of a legal interpretation. He answered each question honestly. No heritage assessment, no legal review, a translation made by his predecessor from a primary document in the archive. She said, "I appreciate you bringing this to me, but I cannot base operational policy on an untranslated primary document and an informal translation." She paused. "I will flag it for the organization's heritage review process." He understood what the heritage review process meant. It meant months, possibly longer. The full moon was 3 weeks away. He said, "The review will take time." She said, "These things do." He went back to the cottage. He stood at the eastern gate in the dusk and looked at the forest and said nothing. And the forest said nothing. And between them, the agreement sat in the cold highland air like something that had been in place for a very long time and was becoming uncertain for the first time. He tried again on Friday. This time he brought the maintenance ledgers, 3 volumes, the oldest ones. He opened each to a full moon entry and showed her the notation Eastern Gate, unlocked at dusk, secured at dawn, repeated without variation across 140 years of successive groundskeepers. She looked at each one carefully. She said, "This demonstrates a consistent practice. It does not explain the rationale behind the practice." He said, "The rationale has never needed to be explained because everyone who held this role understood it directly from their predecessor." She said, "That is exactly the problem, Corvin. Institutional knowledge that exists only in direct transmission is the most fragile kind. When the transmission fails, the knowledge is lost. My role here is to document and protect what this cemetery requires. I cannot do that with information that has never been formally recorded." He said, "Some things cannot be formally recorded." She looked at him. The look of someone who found that statement professionally unsatisfying and personally understood it more than she wanted to. She said, "Show me what you can show me in the records. I will work with what I have." He went back to the cottage. The full moon was 11 days away. He spent those 11 days in the archive room. The archive room was at the back of the main building, stone walls. A single high window that let in a column of gray highland light across the middle of each day. Shelves running floor to ceiling on 3 sides. Boxes and ledgers and folders arranged by period, by category, by the specific organizational logic of every groundskeeper who had maintained this archive before him, each one slightly different, each one's system intelligible once you had spent enough time with it. He had spent enough time with all of it. He pulled the maintenance ledgers first. 140 years of them, each one a large cloth-bound volume. The spines faded, the pages inside dense with the handwriting of successive groundskeepers, different hands, different inks, different degrees of precision in the recording, but consistent in structure across every volume, because the structure was the job and the job did not change. He opened the first volume, the oldest, the handwriting of a man named Aldrich Vorn, who had been the first groundskeeper of Haldren Cemetery and who had maintained these records for 19 years before passing them to his successor. He turned to the first full moon entry. Eastern Gate unlocked at dusk, secured at dawn, boundary wall clear, northern path clear. He turned pages. The same notation appeared on every full moon entry across Aldrich Vorn's 19 years. Exactly the same wording, the same order. Written in the same matter-of-fact register as mow the south path and clear the chapel guttering. Not highlighted, not explained. Simply recorded the way you recorded a task that was part of the job and required no further annotation because everyone who needed to understand it already did. He worked forward through the ledgers. Groundskeeper after groundskeeper. The handwriting changing, the ink changing, the years accumulating, the notation never changing. Eastern Gate unlocked at dusk. Secured at dawn, 140 years. Every full moon, without exception, without explanation. He set the ledgers aside and pulled the church records. He set the last ledger down. He sat for a moment in the archive room's gray light, with the accumulated weight of 140 years of consistent notation and felt, not for the first time, the specific quality of something that had been true for so long that its truth had stopped requiring justification and become simply the condition of the place. The ledgers did not explain the Eastern Gate. They did not need to. They recorded it the way you recorded a fact of geography. The ridge runs north to south. The valley floor floods in March. The Eastern Gate is unlocked on full moon nights. Not because someone decided these things should be true, because they were true and had always been true, and the job of the record was to acknowledge them. He put the ledgers back in their order on the shelf. Then he went further back than the ledgers reached. The church records were older, pre-cemetery, but there was one box he had not opened in several years, a flat archival box at the bottom of the oldest shelf, unlabeled, the cardboard darkened with age and handling. He had found it in his second year. He had opened it carefully and found inside a collection of documents that predated the church records by what he estimated, based on the quality of the vellum and the style of the script, to be at least a century, possibly more. They were not in any language he could read. He had shown them in his 5th year to a historian from the university in the nearest city who had come to assess the cemetery's archival holdings. She had looked at them for a long time. She had said the script was a regional dialect variant that had fallen out of use before systematic records of it had been made. She said partial translation was possible, but full translation was unlikely. She said the documents appeared to be administrative in nature, land records, boundary definitions, agreements of some kind. He had asked about the agreements. She had looked at one document in particular, the longest, the most carefully preserved, the one with a specific symbol, repeated at regular intervals down the left margin, and said that the symbol appeared in other documents from this region, from the same period, and was associated, in the partial scholarship that existed on this dialect, with obligations of acknowledgement, agreements in which one party committed to recognizing the presence and right of another. He had asked, "What other party?" She had looked at the symbol for a long time. She had said, "The scholarship does not specify." She had photographed the documents and sent him a partial translation 6 months later. 3 paragraphs. The rest, she said, was beyond reliable recovery. The 3 paragraphs described a boundary, a line between one kind of territory and another, a condition attached to the boundary that required, on specific nights determined by the moon cycle, the boundary to be opened, not crossed. Opened. The distinction, she noted, appeared significant in the original. A specific word used for the opening that was different from the word used for crossing, and that she could only translate approximately as acknowledged or received. The boundary is to be acknowledged on the nights of the full moon. He had read those words and felt the specific quality of something settling into place that had always been in place but had not previously had language. He had filed the translation in his personal log. He had put the documents back in their box. He had continued his work. Now he took the box from the shelf again and opened it carefully and removed the longest document and held it in the archive room's single column of gray light. The vellum was cool and dry under his hands, the script dense and regular, the hand of someone who had written this with the specific care of someone recording something that needed to last. The symbol in the left margin repeated, "Consistent." The symbol the historian had associated with obligations of acknowledgement ran the full length of the document like a spine. He could not read it. He had never been able to read it. But he had held it enough times across 32 years that the holding itself had become a kind of reading, not of the words, of the intention behind them. The intention of someone who had sat in whatever room they sat in whatever year this had been written, and had understood that the agreement at the boundary needed to be recorded. That future people who did not know what they were inheriting needed to know that they were inheriting something, that the record needed to survive even if the language did not. It had survived. He held it for a moment longer. Then he put it back in its box and set it on the desk with the other documents he was bringing to Solon. She could not read it either. But the physical reality of it mattered. How old it was, what it had survived. The symbol in the margin that a historian had associated with obligations of acknowledgement, running the full length of the page like something that had always known it would need to last. Then the church records. These were older, pre-cemetery. The handwriting shifting through multiple generations of clergy, the quality of the paper degrading toward the earliest entries, the ink fading in some places to a pale brown that required him to angle the record under the archive room's single window to read it. He was not looking for the official entries. He was looking for the margins. He had found the margin notes on his second week 32 years ago and had returned to them many times since. 3 entries across the first decade of records in which a priest, a man whose name appeared nowhere in the official church documents, identified only by his distinctive cramped handwriting, had written observations that were not part of the record he was maintaining, but could not, apparently, be left unwritten. He found the first. The groundskeeper informs me the eastern gate must remain unsealed on the nights of the full moon. He has shown me the land agreement. I do not pretend to understand the full import of the condition it contains. I have decided to accept it as a matter of local custom and proceed accordingly. He found the second. The gate was left unlocked as required. Whatever came to it in the night did not enter the cemetery grounds. It stood at the boundary. It left before dawn. I observed this from the vestry window. I have nothing useful to add to this observation, except that I no longer question the protocol. He found the third. This one was written in a smaller and more deliberate hand, as though the man who wrote it had understood he was writing something that mattered and had slowed himself accordingly. He read it slowly. He had read it many times before. But reading it now, in the archive room with the Highland light fading toward late afternoon, and the full moon 11 days away, and the padlock on the eastern gate that should not have been there, the words carried a weight they had not carried on previous readings. I have been at this parish for 11 years. The protocol has been observed without incident across every full moon of those 11 years. I have come to understand that the gate is not left open for us. It is left open to acknowledge something that was here before us and will be here after us, and asks only to be acknowledged. That acknowledgement costs us nothing. Withdrawing it would cost us considerably more. I commend this understanding to whoever reads these notes after me. Corvin sat with the record open in his hands for a long time. The priest who wrote this had been dead for 2 centuries. He had sat in whatever room he sat in when he was not maintaining his official records, and he had written, in the margins of documents that would survive him by generations, the understanding he had arrived at through observation and good faith, and the specific quality of attention a careful person brought to something they could not explain but were not willing to dismiss. Withdrawing it would cost us considerably more. He did not know what the priest had understood the cost to be. He had never seen the gate close before this month. He did not know how long the patience held when the acknowledgement was withdrawn. He did not want to find out. He put the church record back on its shelf. He went further back. The land agreement, the original deed. He did not need to open it. He knew the translation by heart, but he took it from its box and held it anyway because he was going to show it to Solon, and the physical reality of it mattered: how old it was, what it had survived, the care with which it had been preserved across generations of people who understood it mattered even when they did not fully understand why. He held it for a moment in the archive room's fading light. Then he gathered everything the church records, the maintenance ledgers, the original deed, his personal log with the translation, and carried them to Solon's office. He laid them on her desk. He said, "I need you to read all of this before the full moon." She looked at the stack. She looked at him. She said, "Sit down, Corvin." He sat. She read. She was thorough. She gave each document the attention it deserved. She worked through the maintenance ledgers, first turning pages slowly, tracing the notation across decade after decade of consistent recording with the focused attention of someone building a picture she had not anticipated needing to build. Then, the church records. She read the official entries and found the margin notes without Corvin pointing them out, and read them twice. The third margin note she read 3 times. Then she looked at him. She said, "The land agreement. Show me both versions." He opened his personal log to the first page and set it beside the original document. She looked at both. She looked at the original for a long time, not reading it, since she could not read the dialect, but looking at it with the specific attention of someone examining the physical reality of a thing rather than its content, how old it was, what it had survived. The care with which it had been preserved across generations of people who understood it mattered. Then she read the translation. She read it twice. She set the log down carefully. She said, "I understand this is a long-standing practice with a documented history." She paused. "But I cannot base current operational policy on a translated condition from a land agreement that has not been legally reviewed." She paused again. "What comes to the gate, Corvin? Specifically," he said, "I cannot give you a specific answer that fits within your framework." She said, "Try." He said, "Something from the forest, something large, something that has been coming to this boundary for as long as the records reach and possibly longer. Something that stands at the open gate and receives the acknowledgement of the open gate and then returns to the forest before dawn. In 32 years, it has never entered the cemetery grounds. In 32 years, it has never caused damage or disturbance. In 32 years, the agreement has held because both sides have honored it. She looked at him steadily. He said, "The gate has been locked for 3 weeks. The next full moon is in 4 days. I am asking you to unlock it." She said, "I cannot unlock an access point based on an undocumented liability assessment." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Then I am asking you to come to the cottage on the night of the full moon and observe." She was quiet. The afternoon light through the office window shifted slightly. Outside the window, the cemetery lay in its gray highland light, the stones pale, the paths clear, the eastern gate visible at the far end with its new padlock. She said, "All right." The full moon rose at 9:47 p.m. The sky above the valley was clear, cold, the specific highland cold of an autumn night that arrived fast and stayed total. The stars visible between the ridge lines and the strip of sky, the valley allowed. Corvin and Solon sat in the groundskeeper's cottage, 2 chairs positioned at the window that faced the eastern gate. He had set them there before she arrived. He had also put the kettle on and made tea and set 2 cups on the small table between the chairs. The tea went cold before either of them thought to drink it. The cemetery was still around them. The stones pale in the moonlight, the highland granite catching the cold light and giving it back in a specific way that Corvin had been watching for 32 years and never quite stopped finding remarkable. The northern path silver gray with its new gravel. The boundary wall at the far end dark and low against the tree line beyond it. The eastern gate was locked, the padlock catching the moonlight in a way the gate had never caught it before tonight. Neither of them spoke. Corvin had told her on the walk to the cottage that they were likely to be there for several hours and that the best approach was simply to watch and to ask whatever questions she needed to ask afterward rather than during. She had nodded. She was a person who understood how to be present in a situation without filling it. At 11:23 p.m., something came out of the forest. The cemetery at night was not the same place as the cemetery in daylight. Corvin had understood this since his first full moon watch 32 years ago and had never found a way to explain it that satisfied him. It was not that it became threatening. It was not that the darkness changed its character. It was something more specific than that. In daylight, the cemetery was a place of maintenance of tasks and schedules and the ongoing careful attention that kept a place like this functioning. At night, under the full moon, it became something older than its function. The stones were still stones. The paths were still paths. But they had stopped being objects of maintenance and become simply what they were: granite placed at intervals across highland ground. Paths worn by the passage of people over a very long time. A boundary wall at the northern edge beyond which the forest had been standing since before any of this existed. The maintenance fell away. What remained was the place itself. He had tried to write this in his personal log once, in his 8th year, and had read it back the following morning and found it inadequate and crossed it out. Some things resisted the log's register. This was one of them. You could record what happened on a full moon night, the arrival, the duration, the departure, but you could not record what the night itself felt like. The specific quality of sitting in the cottage with the stove going, and the moonlight across the cemetery, and the forest at the boundary wall dark and permanent, and the knowledge arriving not as thought but as the physical condition of being in this place at this hour, that you were one in a long line of people who had sat exactly here and watched exactly this and understood that their watching mattered. 32 years of full moon nights. He was comfortable with this. He was not certain Solon was comfortable with it yet. She was present. She had the focused quality of someone who had decided to be here and was here completely. But there was a difference between the stillness of someone who was at ease and the stillness of someone who was holding themselves carefully against something they had not yet fully absorbed, and he recognized the second kind in the way she held her teacup, in the particular set of her shoulders, and the way her eyes moved across the cemetery, with the systematic attention of someone whose professional instincts were still active even when the professional framework had nothing to offer. He did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. You did not talk someone into comfort with this. You sat with them in the dark and let the place do what it did, and trusted that a person capable of paying the quality of attention Solon Vray paid to things would arrive. In her own time, at whatever understanding the place offered. The moon moved. The cemetery held its stillness. The stove ticked quietly in the corner. Outside the window, the eastern gate stood locked in the moonlight, and the forest beyond the boundary wall was a dark mass against the sky, and the cold came off it in the way it always came off it on full moon nights. Not the cold of weather, but the cold of something vast and still and completely present. A cold that had been at the same temperature for longer than the valley, had people in it, and would be at that temperature long after. Corvin had his hands around his teacup. The tea was cold. He did not move to make more. Corvin felt it before he saw it. The specific quality of attention coming off the tree line, changing, sharpening, directing itself toward the gate with the focus of something that had been moving toward this point with intention and had now arrived. The same quality he had felt on every full moon night for 32 years, standing at the cottage window or at the gate itself. The quality that he had stopped finding alarming 29 years ago, and had since understood as simply the announcement of arrival. Something was coming to the gate, something that had been coming to this gate for longer than the cemetery had existed. Beside him, he felt Solon change. Not dramatically, not visibly if you were not paying attention. The specific quality of someone whose body has registered something their mind has not yet processed. A slight straightening in the chair, a stillness arriving that was different from the previous stillness, her hand tightening around the cold teacup without her being aware that she had done it. She felt it too. Then it was at the gate, large, still in the moonlight with the particular stillness of something that had no reason to move because it had arrived where it intended to arrive. The specific shape of it visible through the cottage window, not fully, not in a way that resolved into a form that could be described precisely in any report, but enough to understand the scale of it, enough to understand that it had been carrying itself through this forest for a very long time and knew this boundary the way you know a place you have been returning to across your entire life. It stood at the locked gate. The padlock between it and the acknowledgement it had been coming to receive for longer than this cemetery existed. It did not move. Solon was completely still beside Corvin. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the gate. He had learned, across 32 years of full moon nights, that the watching mattered, that the presence of an attentive witness at the cottage window was part of the acknowledgement, that turning away diminished something he could not afford to diminish. He watched. The thing at the gate stood for an hour. The moon moved across the strip of sky above the valley. The cemetery stayed still around them. The stones pale and the paths gray and the boundary wall dark and the forest beyond it darker still. And the thing at the gate, standing at the locked gate, with the patience of something that had been patient for a very long time. It did not force the gate. It did not make any sound. It did not pace or shift or show any quality of growing agitation. It waited. In the way of something accustomed to waiting not restlessly, but with a deep settled quality, the patience of something that existed on a different timescale, from the people watching it from the cottage window, and found the duration of a single night well within the range of what it was prepared to endure. 2 hours. 3. The moon was past its highest point now, beginning its slow descent toward the western ridgeline. The cold in the cottage had deepened despite the stove. Corvin had not moved. Solon had not moved. Neither of them had spoken. At 3:14 a.m., it turned and walked back toward the forest. Unhurried. Not the departure of something that had been defeated or repelled or had given up. The departure of something that had come to receive an acknowledgement and had not received it and had not forced the matter and was returning to the forest with the specific quality of something that would be back. That would always be back. That had always been back. The forest took it in the way the forest took everything. It kept completely, without remainder, leaving the tree line still and the cemetery still, and the eastern gate standing in the moonlight with its padlock, and the specific silence of a boundary that had just failed to honor its obligation for the first time in the cemetery's full history. Solon sat in the cottage chair and watched the tree line for a long time after it was gone. The sky outside the window was beginning to change at its edges. The specific shift from deep black toward the first dark gray of pre-dawn. The forest beyond the boundary wall was a hard, dark mass against the lightning sky. the eastern gate still and locked in the foreground. She said, "How long has it been coming here?" Corvin said, "As long as the records reach, possibly longer." She said, "And when the gate is open," he said, "it comes, it stands, it receives the acknowledgement of the open gate, it leaves before dawn. It has never entered the grounds. It has never caused harm." She said, "And when it is closed," he said, "it comes, it stands, it waits, it leaves." He paused. So far. The weight of that pause sat in the cottage for a moment. She said, "What does the closing of the gate cost it?" He said, "I do not know. I know what the opening of the gate gives it. It gives it acknowledgement, the understanding that it has a right to come to this boundary and stand at it and be received." He paused. "I do not know what the closing of the gate takes away. I have never seen the gate close before this month. I do not know how long its patience holds." She said, "But you believe it has a limit." He said, "Everything has a limit." She looked at the eastern gate, the new padlock, the forest beyond. She said, "I will need to document this." He said, "Document what you can." She said, "I do not have a category for what I observed tonight." He said, "No, I did not have one either when I arrived here 32 years ago. I made peace with not having one." She looked at him. The expression of someone who has just had their entire professional framework tested against something it was not built to contain and is deciding in real time how to proceed, not panicking, not retreating, deciding, with the specific methodical quality of someone who had been making difficult decisions for long enough that the difficulty was familiar even when the situation was entirely new. She said, "The gate stays unlocked." He said, "Yes." She said, "On full moon nights." He said, "Every full moon night, without exception. From dusk to dawn." She nodded. She stood. She straightened her jacket with the efficient movement of someone returning to professional register after a significant departure from it. She said, "I will need to find a way to document this that the organization can work with." He said, "Document it as a long-standing heritage access protocol with historical precedent and no record of adverse incidents in 32 years of operation." She looked at him. Something in her expression that was not quite a smile but contained elements of one. The specific expression of someone recognizing that the person across from them has been several steps ahead of this conversation for longer than the conversation has been happening. She said, "That is exactly how I will document it." She went back to the main building. Corvin stayed in the cottage. He sat in his chair at the window and looked at the eastern gate in the pre-dawn gray. He held his personal log in his hands and opened it to the last entry. He wrote, "The new administrator observed the full moon visit. The gate was locked. She saw what a locked gate produces. She has made the right decision." He paused with the pen above the page. Then he added, "She will not need to be told again." He closed the log. He got up. He took the padlock key from his coat pocket. He went to the eastern gate. He removed the padlock. He opened the gate. He stood in the open gateway for a moment and looked at the forest, and the forest looked back with the patient attention it had always brought to this boundary. Vast, still, present, completely at home in the dark that was already beginning to lighten at its edges. He closed the gate without locking it. He went back to the cottage. He made tea that was actually hot this time and sat at the window and watched the sky lighten over the valley and the forest and the cemetery and the open eastern gate and felt the specific relief of someone who has maintained something carefully for a very long time and has come very close to losing it and has not lost it and understands more completely than before exactly what they are maintaining and why. 3 days later, Solon submitted her operational review to the organization. Under Eastern Gate Protocol, she wrote, "Long-standing heritage access arrangement with continuous historical documentation dating to the cemetery's founding. Arrangement reviewed and assessed as presenting no operational liability. Protocol confirmed for continuation." Corvin Mayel's institutional knowledge of this arrangement is essential to its maintenance and is formally noted as a critical operational asset. She showed Corvin the draft before she submitted it. He read it. He handed it back. He said, "It is accurate." She said, "It is as accurate as I can make it within the framework I have available." He said, "That is all any of us can do." She submitted it. The organization filed it. Nobody from the regional office asked any follow-up questions. The weeks between the first and second full moon settled into a new rhythm. It was not dramatic. Nothing at Haldron Cemetery was ever dramatic. The cemetery did not operate in dramatic registers. It operated in the specific patient register of a place that had been here for a very long time and had learned that patience was the only posture that made sense when you were going to be here for a very long time more. But the rhythm was different. Solon came to the cottage for tea on the mornings when her schedule allowed. Not often, 3 or 4 times in the weeks between the full moons. She sat at the window that faced the eastern gate and drank her tea and looked at the forest beyond and asked questions that were not the questions she had been asking in her first weeks at Haldron Cemetery. She did not ask about maintenance, schedules, or liability assessments, or operational rationale. She asked about the winters. She asked which full moon nights had been hardest to maintain across 32 years, the wet ones, the cold ones, the nights when the valley weather was bad enough that staying at the cottage window had required effort. She asked whether there had ever been a full moon night when Corvin had not been present for the visit. He said, "Once. My second year. I had a fever. I left the gate unlocked at dusk and went to bed. In the morning, I found the gate exactly as I had left it. Open. The ground at the gate showed the visit had occurred as usual." She said, "It did not require your presence." He said, "The gate required my presence to unlock it. The visit did not require my presence to occur." He paused. "I learned the difference that night. The gate is what I maintain. What happens at the gate is not mine to manage." She said, "That is a useful distinction." He said, "It took me a full year to find it." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I have been thinking about the priest's margin notes." He said, "Which part?" She said, "Withdrawing it would cost us considerably more." He paused. He did not say what the cost was. Corvin said, "No." She said, "Do you know what the cost is?" He said, "I know what the cost is not. It is not the kind of cost that arrives immediately. It is not the kind of cost that announces itself." He paused. "It is the kind of cost that accumulates the way damage accumulates in a structure that has been neglected slowly, below the threshold of daily notice, until one day the structure fails and the failure appears to have come from nowhere." She held her teacup. She looked at the forest. She said, "I am going to recommend to the organization that the Eastern Gate Protocol be incorporated into the site's heritage management plan, formally, with the relevant archival documentation attached." He said, "They will ask questions." She said, "I will answer the ones I can answer. The ones I cannot answer, I will classify as pending further research." She paused. "That is accurate enough." He said, "It is accurate enough." She finished her tea. She went back to the main building. Corvin watched her go and felt, for the first time since she had arrived at Haldron Cemetery, the specific quality of someone doing the same work alongside a person who understood what the work actually required. It was not a feeling he had expected to have. He was glad of it. The following month, Solon attended the next full moon observation with Corvin in the cottage. She brought a thermos of tea this time. She came prepared. She sat at the window with the specific, settled quality of someone who had decided that this was part of her role at Haldron Cemetery and was learning how to hold it. Not with the shocked stillness of the first observation, with the particular deliberate presence of someone who had accepted what they were witness to and was now choosing to witness it properly. The gate was open. At 2 a.m., something came out of the forest and walked to the eastern gate and stood at it. The specific quality of its arrival different from the previous month. Not confused. Not standing at a closed gate trying to understand what the closing meant. Standing at an open gate with the settled quality of something that had found what it came to find and was receiving it. The acknowledgement. It stood for 40 minutes. Then it turned and walked back to the forest. The departure of something that had come to receive an acknowledgement and had received it, and had no further reason to stay. Solon watched it go until the forest took it back. She said nothing for a long time. The pre-dawn silence of the cemetery around them, the stones pale, the boundary wall dark, the eastern gate open in the moonlight. Then she said, "Does it know we are here?" Corvin said, "Yes." She said, "Has it always known?" He said, "I believe so." She said, "And it does not mind." He said, "We are not in its way. We are in the cottage. The gate is open. The acknowledgement is given." He paused. "We are doing our part of the agreement. It is doing its part." She held her teacup. She looked at the forest. She said, "How do you hold it?" 32 years of holding this." He said, "The same way you hold anything that is larger than your framework for it." He paused. "You stop trying to put it inside the framework. You build your life around the outside of it instead." She considered this for a long time. She said, "I think I can do that." He said, "I think you already are." The next morning she came to the cottage before her working day began and stood with Corvin at the eastern gate in the early light. The gate opened, the forest beyond it dark and permanent and completely still, the boundary wall with its untrimmed grass, the northern path with its new gravel catching the first morning light. She looked at the gate for a long time. Then she said, "The grass at the boundary wall." He said, "Yes." She said, "The trimming is scheduled for next month." He said, "Yes." She said, "Cancel it." He said, "Yes." She looked at the forest for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back to the main building. Corvin watched her go. Then he turned back to the eastern gate. He checked the lock. He confirmed the gate was properly unsealed. He looked at the forest beyond the boundary wall, the old-growth canopy, the permanent near dark below it, the cold coming off it in the morning air. That was not the cold of weather, but the cold of something vast and still that had been at the same temperature for longer than any record of this valley reached. The forest looked back. It always looked back. Corvin had understood this since his first week. He had been standing at this gate for 32 years, and the forest had been looking back at him for every one of those 32 years, and he had long since stopped finding it remarkable and started finding it simply true. He picked up his maintenance log. He began his morning rounds. Main entrance, chapel, the stones, the northwest corner, the northern path, the boundary wall. Same sequence, same order, same specific, unhurried attention brought to each task, because each task mattered and had always mattered and would always matter for as long as he was here to perform it. The third full moon came on a night when the highland weather had settled cold and still over the valley, the sky clear all the way to the ridgelines, the stars sharp between them. Solon was at the cottage before Corvin had finished setting the chairs. She brought the thermos again. She also brought a notebook, small, leather-covered, the kind that fit in a jacket pocket. She set it on the table between the chairs and did not open it. She simply wanted it there. Corvin understood. Some things needed to be documented even before you knew what form the documentation would take. The gate was open. At 1:47 a.m., something came out of the forest. Corvin felt it the way he always felt it, the specific quality of attention from the tree line sharpening and directing itself toward the gate with a focus of something that knew exactly where it was going. He settled back in his chair. He was comfortable with this, had been comfortable with it for 32 years. The comfort of someone who has been in the presence of something vast and patient so many times that the vastness and the patience have become simply the texture of a particular kind of evening. Beside him, Solon straightened slightly in her chair, her hand finding the notebook on the table without looking at it, holding it, not opening it. The thing came to the gate. It stood. The specific quality of its standing different again from the month before. Not the confused standing of a closed gate, not the relieved standing of the first open gate after the closure. Something settled, something that had reestablished itself in its relationship with this boundary, and was standing at it now with the ease of something returning to a practice that had been briefly interrupted and was now restored. It stood for 52 minutes. Then it turned and walked back to the forest. The departure of something that had received what it came to receive and was carrying it back to wherever in the dark old forest it went when it was not at the gate. Solon sat for a long time after it was gone. She opened her notebook. She wrote something. She closed it. Corvin did not ask what she had written. She would tell him if she wanted to. She was a person who said what needed to be said and held what needed to be held, and he had learned this about her across the months she had been at Haldron Cemetery and had come to trust it the same way he trusted the morning sequence. And the gate check and the maintenance log, she said, it stayed longer this time. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, I do not know. It may be because the gate has been restored. It may simply be that some full moons are longer than others in the way that matters to it. He paused. The records do not show a consistent duration. Each visit is its own. She said, 52 minutes. He said, yes. She said, I am going to record the duration in the operational log under Eastern Gate Protocol. She paused. I will call it access duration. It is accurate enough. He said, it is accurate enough. She closed the notebook. She poured tea from the thermos into both cups, hot this time, the steam rising in the cold cottage air. She handed him his cup and held her own, and they sat at the window in the pre-dawn stillness and drank their tea and looked at the open eastern gate and the forest beyond it and said nothing more for a long time, because nothing more needed to be said. The sky began to lighten at its edges. The forest held what it held. The gate held what it held. At the end of the morning rounds, Corvin returned to the eastern gate. He checked it one final time. Open. The forest beyond it, dark and patient and permanent. Everything exactly as it should be. He wrote in his maintenance log. Eastern gate, unsealed. Full moon in 25 days. Access duration 52 minutes. Grounds clear. Boundary wall intact. Agreement holding. He closed the log. He went to make tea. Behind him, the cemetery lay in its morning light, the stones pale, the paths clear, the boundary wall dark against the tree line. The eastern gate open in the specific way of something that had always been open and would remain open because the people responsible for it now understood what the opening meant and why it mattered and what it cost to close it. The forest held what it held. The gate held what it held. The agreement between them held what it had always held, the accumulated weight of every full moon night across every generation that had understood this place well enough to maintain it. Corvin Mayall was the 34th groundskeeper of Haldron Cemetery. He would not be the last. Whoever came after him would find his personal log in the archive room. First page, the translation of the land agreement in his careful handwriting. And beneath it, one additional line he had added on the morning after Solenvray had sat with him in the cottage and watched something vast and patient stand at a locked gate and wait. The line read, show them the gate first. Let the forest do the rest of the explaining. It always does. If you made it this far, you already know what Scar Howl is. Hit subscribe. The forest remembers everyone who listens. It will remember you.